Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning on cyber compliance in public sector procurement. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Richard Muir, and I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, and a very warm welcome to you this morning. Just from a housekeeping point of view, we're going to be having a question and answer session at about 10:40. So I would ask for you to use the chat function if you've got questions. And let's please try and make it as informal and as interactive as possible. I believe the session's being recorded purely for internal purposes. So please get the questions coming in and we can get the conversation going. So I'm delighted to be working in partnership with the Scotland 5G Centre and Illuminate Technologies to bring you this webinar this morning. And we all know that there are many public procurement opportunities for the private sector to tender for. Identifying them and completing the bid, however, can be a very complex process with many regulations. And increasingly, one feature of the bidding process is compliance with cybersecurity requirements. And it can be prove to be very disincentive for small businesses when applying. So we're going to be hearing a little bit more from Michael Burns, Business Development Manager at the Scotland 5G Centre. And then we're going to hand over from Michael to Doug Carson, Solutions Architect from Illuminate Technologies. And Doug's going to take us through his contribution. And that will give us time for a Q&A at the end. So today we're going to look at some of the features of these requirements around bidding, explain how SMEs can address these, and how this can stimulate greater interest from smaller providers into this significant market. And we're delighted, as I said, to introduce Michael Burns from the Scotland 5G Centre. Michael is a familiar face for many of our members and is seconded from the Research and Innovation Services at the University of Glasgow. Michael is going to tell us a little bit about the Scotland 5G Centre and then introduce our speaker today, Doug Carson, Solutions Architect from Illuminate Technologies UK Limited. So Michael, over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to share some slides here. Can we see those slides okay at the other side? No, that's a no. Should be a yes any minute now. Okay, is that it now? Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Okay. There you go, Michael.
Yeah. This is a quick introduction from myself at the Scotland 5G Centre, just to give a bit of context around today's meeting. Although the Scotland 5G Centre is not a specialist in cybersecurity, it's one of the areas that invariably will impact on our work going forward. So 5G as a cross-cutting technology will have to consider lots of things in its development and application and the use cases. Cybersecurity will be at the core of it, as the networks that we build in the years to come have to be reliable, have the confidence of the users. So the background to the Scotland 5G Centre is from a Scottish Government initiative recognising the potential of 5G as an economic driver and deliverer of social benefit. So these slides will be shared with you, but there are some numbers in here. They are big numbers, and these are taken from Deloitte a year ago, highlighting the potential impact of 5G as a game changer in terms of economic development and ability. The 5G Centre was formed as a result of the four founding partners at the centre, the University of Glasgow, Clyde, Futures Trust, the National Infrastructure Investment Agency, and the Scottish Government, in particular, the Digital Director of the Government, have grant funded the centre for 2.5 years. So the mission of the centre, as you can see, there'll be no system there, but it's to drive 5G across public service, Accreditation, medical R&D, use case development, in social and economic context. The big emphasis on rural as well. So there'll be a fairly good balance between rural and urban development. Objectives of the centre, once these slides are out, drill down to a little more detail, or indeed go to the website where there's quite a bit of information on who we are and what we do. In broad terms, we've been set up to support communities' economic growth. three what we call Wave 1 projects running at the moment, one on urban innovation, looking at the connection between 5G development and urban innovation districts in Glasgow. Looking at rural development, which is up in the Orkney Islands and at the moment, but business the 5G sustainable in rural economies. Third objective, looking at public infrastructure effectively used platform for the accelerated deployment of 5G infrastructure across the country. What we're calling our Wave 2 projects are still very much a work in progress, but these will be around a network of regional hubs designed to encourage the uptake and development of 5G across a range of scenarios. And this one is pitched more at smaller providers, SMEs, local development agencies, local authorities, to build awareness, focusing on that kind of smaller startup, scale-up type things, an attempt to introduce and drive the use of 5G across many more use cases than we're working on at the moment. Big health warning on this one. This is only for use written at the moment, but this is how it's beginning to come into focus around development of these regions. Maybe they might interest that they will develop. We think that Forth Valley will be the first to launch on this one, hopefully early next year, followed probably by Dundee and then possibly Kilmarnock. That's about the only three we're firm on at the moment. So there is an opportunity to influence discussion around the identification of future hubs in the new year. You want to join that conversation. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of the Scotland 5G Centre. Lots more information on the website. If you contact me directly, feel free to do so. You can either come to the centre's website or go to the chamber to my contact details. So thank you for that. I'm now going to pass you over to Carson for the main event today. Doug is going to talk about the importance of cybersecurity being combined with in public sector procurement. Doug is best placed to tell you who he is, what he does, and what the main issues they will be. So over to you, Doug.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Just share my screen. So what we're going to cover today is what compliance means to us. So Illuminate Technologies is not a service provider, so we're not trying to sell you cybersecurity services. We're actually part of the cybersecurity supply chain. So I'm going to give an explanation of our journey through cyber compliance, both as a large US megacorp, which is kind of where we started off from, and when we became a medium enterprise within Scotland. So one of the larger scale-ups within Scotland doing cybersecurity products. And then we're going to talk about public sector compliance and the cybersecurity perspective on that. Now, there is actually some very good guidance from the Scottish Government on cybersecurity compliance that leads through the criteria that's required and the key points that they have to follow as well. So really, it's about understanding the position that the Scottish Government and any public body is, for that matter, when they're procuring goods and services that are going into infrastructure. And there are four main principles in that. There are supply chain principles. So you've got to understand, how the procurement agencies are thinking. Then we're going to talk about some of the use cases, and that really talks about 5G and how that interacts with the public sector. And that's kind of driving why we're involved with the Scotland 5G Centre. The biggest market for 5G is actually going to be the public service. It's got relatively small amount of the business is to do with buying a handset from a Vodafone or a BT shop and doing that. We're going to talk about the cyber assurance processes, and key on that is implementing a cybersecurity policy within your organization. And I'm going to maybe explain with practical examples how we got there and what guidance we used, and actually how easy it was to do. And then lastly, we'll talk about certification and accreditation and some practical advice on that. Obviously, there's there are organizations that can sell you full compliance that may involve detailed audits, etc. And if that's the journey you're on in terms of procurement, that's entirely appropriate. But most organizations, ourselves included, wanted to start small. So we'll talk about how you start small, how you can do that very cheaply and scale up. And then lastly, Michael kindly supplied 3 example tenders. And then we can look at that through a lens of cybersecurity based on what we've learned before. So a kind of introduction to Illuminate. We have a long history within Scotland that actually goes back 50 years, but we're probably a new cybersecurity startup. We were actually originally part of Hewlett-Packard, and then we're spun out of that into Agilent Technologies. Just better. So we were spun out of Agilent Technology into Agilent Technologies. Then we're spun out into Keysight Technologies, and then last year we became a fully private company in terms of Illuminate Technologies. So we do capabilities for cyber threat detection, legal compliance in critical communications infrastructure, and public safety applications. So actually one of our very early applications was emergency geolocations. If you make a 999 call, where is that person that made that call? And we were doing that 20 years ago. Now, as mobile networks have been part of the critical infrastructure, there's been more and more requirements for compliance within telecommunications networks, and we supply goods and equipment that go into the network. And what that means is that trickles down into our organization, that we have to have more and more cyber compliance within our solutions. So really we do full scale services, we do sensors, we do data analytics, and then we also deploy those services within organizations, which means that if our stuff is going into public networks or supporting public services, then there has to be cybersecurity embedded in that. And obviously, as things move to 5G, that's going to ramp up a bit more. So mobile networks are critical infrastructure. We talk a lot about enable services, but they actually enable public services. So energy, emergency services. So, the 999 service is actually, there's an overlay called the ESN that's going to provide that within the networks. Connected health, that seemed like a pipe dream, obviously about, a year ago, but that's accelerated, really quickly now. So it's, we've been kind of forced into, having to do, pictures, sending them to your GP to do remote diagnostics. You can see that's going to accelerate, and then as we have connected sensors, that's going to change as well. And transport as another obvious one. Smart motorways are one start in that, but that's going to end up as fully connected cars. So everything's going to be fully connected. 5G is designed to support these, and mobile networks are going to move away, still have a baseline to provide your services, but they're actually going to enable critical services. Now, since these are public services, these are going to be, the tenders that are going to come up are public sector tenders. So you may not necessarily be providing the connectivity services, but you may be providing, IoT devices, for example, for connected healthcare. So there will be a cybersecurity angle in that because they're a critical infrastructure. And the people procuring these services, have a legal obligation to make sure that there's a high degree of cybersecurity compliance, and that's going to trickle down to you as a supplier. Just to look at 5G in general, the 5G is normally done as a triangle. And the very top is what you think of as 5G, which is high-speed data services, sort of megabits to the handset, real-time video, streaming sports events, that sort of thing. Actually, where a lot of the money is the stuff at the very bottom of the triangle, and that's perhaps about 2 years away. But as you saw from Michael's previous slide, we're starting to put those early lighthouse applications in place. And you can see they're very public sector focused as you move down. The smart city applications, you know, connected vehicles, transportation, industrial automation. And these are enabled by two features within 5G. One is that you can collect millions of devices and attach them to the network at very low power. And the other thing is that you have very reliable and low latency communications. So if you see all these use cases here, the stuff that's non-critical is the stuff to your handset. So if your handset gets hacked, you should have bought a virus scanner or had a firewall in it. Critical communications are the stuff at the very bottom, and these will have a higher compliance obligation on it. Now, if we look at the marketplace, so this study was actually in the Rural First 5G program done by University of Strathclyde, but I've cut and pasted this, which looks at the IoT market in general. And you can see that a very small amount of that is in terms of what you call connectivity. In some cases, it's less than 5%. But actually, the services that run on top of that and the enabling platform are huge. So, smart utilities, public safety applications, smart city applications, there are huge, multi-billion euro opportunities globally. So if you think about it, if this would enable you in global markets, so if you can get compliance to work in local markets, the same obligations that are going to be there in Scotland are going to be there in global markets as well. So if you put the investment in to get a good degree of compliance, that's going to enable you in global markets as well. And as you can see, there's a huge scale up. So really the takeaway from this is don't think of 5G as, okay, it's just all about connectivity. It's not. It's a very small part of it. There are these big public service opportunities that are available globally. Of course, and at the cost of that is because they're critical services, there's a higher degree of compliance that's expected as opposed to if you were just doing an end user service. So it's one way to think, well, kind of the so what is there, practically what does that mean? So we've actually been on a compliance journey ourselves, and we probably had the same reaction as many SMEs come, and this is when we were in a US megacorp of 10,000 people. So we already had some small scale research contracts running with the UK government, and basically this came in from the Cabinet Office. Basically, that there was a mandate that Cyber Essentials was mandated, and you can read that yourself. Cyber Essentials is for all organizations of all sizes and all sectors. Government's widely encouraging it. Therefore, any contracts after the 1st of October will be mandated. And that was, our first reaction was, I think, explanation mark, because really it's kind of almost like forced onto it. It was a kind of lights out thing. We can't do any more contracts. And if we looked at Cyber Essentials at that time, we didn't really know what the standard was about. And then we looked at the people that had it, and they all seemed to be large, prime contractors. So as a smaller contractor, we almost felt that was, this isn't a level playing field. What we then done away was kind of calmed down, walked away from it, and then looked at our current IT status. And as it turned out, we were remarkably good. Most organizations will have an IT policy, an IT security policy. It's no organization is completely chaotic because most organizations are very professional. The vast majority of it. So it looked remarkably good from our stuff. What we then done was done a self-assessment. So we looked at the stuff that was publicly available, aligned that with our IT policies, and then looked at the differences on that. Once we're satisfied with that we kind of, if you liked, from an exam style, looked at the past papers, then we engaged with a Scottish supplier to get assessment. And the assessment was done very quickly, got a lot of help. There's a lot of good skills within Scotland, lots of great suppliers. It was actually very reassuring. And actually, even though the company was based in California, they were quite happy to take services from Scotland, and then actually were quite impressed with the fact that the centres of excellence were there. So, in fact, that's a good plus point for the Scottish supply base in general, because we had that sort of one-to-one contact and understanding what's going on. And from that assessment, we actually had the certificate that we had assessment and we had accreditation. And because the box was already ticked, we could go for contracts that we didn't go before. And we actually grew a customer base. So traditionally, we hadn't done as much work with the Ministry of Defence, for example. But at that point there, it's just like, well, these guys in Scotland have already done it. And there was some work that was done with, with some of the supply base within Scotland. And because the Ministry of Defence supply chain requires good cybersecurity, we were actually able to kind of join that supply chain and do that. So actually, although the initial reaction was, what, this is going to cost us money, what's the case behind it, it actually was not as scary as we first thought. And you can kind of grow into it as well. So overall, that was the journey that we went through, and hopefully we can try and give you some practical advice on how to do it on a small scale as well. But basically the takeaway from there is, like, we've been here, done it, we've been in your shoes before. So really the first thing on that is to understand your customer and the rules and the obligations that they're under. Procurement are trying to get the best goods and services for the public sector. And they want the widest supply base. It's not in their interest to run with a small number of suppliers and make the process overly complex, because at the end of the day, it's our tax that's paying for this. But on the other hand, they're supplying critical public services. There's an expectation from the public that those services are available and they're reliable, and cybersecurity is going to be part of that. So this document is available online. It's from the Scottish Government, which is the cybersecurity guidance note. So basically this is the guidance for the public sector, and it's the rules of engagement for bringing in suppliers into that. So it's a kind of like a toolkit, a recipe for building a public sector tender, and it's proportionate. It's not trying to say everybody has to have the highest level of cybersecurity compliance. It says, well, think carefully about what you're trying to achieve, and here's what you need to put in place. So this is based from best practice from the National Cybersecurity Centre. So there's reach back into guidance there. The other thing that goes with this is what's called the Cybersecurity Procurement Tool, support tool. There's a link to that there as well. Actually, there has some good stuff there. It actually has the wordings of what the tender is going to look like. There's a spreadsheet that drives the whole process. So it's a bit like getting the past papers from an exam. You can kind of see what's expected, what's going to come up, and you can actually use that as I say, like a past paper. You can do an assessment of your organization as well. So what that means is there shouldn't be any surprises when a tender comes around. So it's almost like you can kind of pre-prepare for that if for the questions that are going to be there. And then you can also kind of gauge your organization and what level of maturity you are with cybersecurity to decide what sort of tenders you're going to go after. Okay. So there are 4 points within that document, and obviously there's going to be 4 slides that follow. So the first is supply chain risk management. There are 12 principles within supply chain risk management. There's a really good infographic, which I've got here from the National Cybersecurity Centre. And it really says to the public sector, take a risk-based approach. Public services may be critical infrastructure, and really the takeaway is you have to think carefully about your supply chain, and you need to make sure that their obligations cascade down into the supply chain, which is yourself. So you can see that, from these bullets, the ones that impact us are the ones about establishing the control. You need to communicate the security requirements to us, and you need to set the minimum cybersecurity requirements. If you make it too complex or too onerous, then people won't respond to the tenders. So you need to say what you need, why you need it, and be transparent about it. And then you need to make sure that it's a shared journey between the supplier and the procurer, that they have their role to play in that, and their processes need to link together. Now, so that they can establish control, they have to define cybersecurity requirements. And what they've defined are 4 use cases, numbered A to D, which define a spectrum of cybersecurity requirements. So they're basically the boxes of compliance, and obviously the higher the degree of the compliance, the more accreditation and onerous it becomes. So the second key point is the use cases. So we said, so the first use case is use case A, which is information shared with you as a supplier has to be protected. And organizations understand that already. GDPR is with us, it's been with us for 2 years. That's the most basic requirement. And obviously GDPR has some compliance requirements around personal data that might be there. So for example, what would a 5G example like that, like hypothetically, the requirements and the contacts if it was a smart bin system for a local authority. Okay, so the fact it's got people's email addresses, etc., and the requirements, the copyright of the organization, and it's identifying information, you need to protect that information. So that's a simple use case. So even if you're just supplying an app, then there's an obligation on it. The next level up is that you're supplying a product or service to the public sector. So that you need to specify security requirements for that. So that might be an IoT sensor for a smart bin, working on this analogy, or it might be the My Bin app that and the cloud service that go with that. This is hardly critical infrastructure, so it would be wrong to have a huge amount of cyber compliance and accreditation associated with that. So it has to be proportionate, but by the same token, there has to be a degree of that it can't be compromised or taken down, or it just falls over. So that's the next level up. Then the next level up is if there's going to be connectivity between your system and a public sector system. Now, obviously that's a step change from the previous one, because it's no longer an air-gapped system or a firewall system or just basic app. And now you've got the ability to do lateral movement between the public sector and your own systems. So if you're the victim of an attack, then there's potential lateral movement into the public sector. So with a hypothetical example, if there was a dispatch system for the recycling fleets that was using a cloud service, if they could gain access into that, if you're providing that connectivity, if you're compromised, then you can stop all the bin lorries in the city. Now, clearly, that's an escalation that's, would require a higher degree of compliance and a higher degree of control with anything that you're specifying as that was going to go into that infrastructure. Then the highest level are national security cases. So if it was a smart electricity grid, for example, that had local wind farm or a local hydro plant, for example, and there were actuators that were going to go into the smart electricity grids, or there was demand driven stuff within that, then clearly that control system is critical. It has national security implications, because you could take down a smart grid. So there's a much higher degree of compliance required on that. So the takeaway from that is you've got to pick your battles. Realize that they'll specify these use cases. You've got every right to go back and say, if they're specifying it's a national security case for a sensor in a smart bin, clearly that's not proportionate. So pick your battles, assess where you are, and then decide to what level you're going to go into. And remember, that's on a journey as well. So you might start small, then tighten up your processes, and then keep on going as well. So again, it's not a one size fits all, but the procurement will have a spectrum of stuff that you can go with as well. Now, the next point is there has to be a cyber assurance process. There's probably a few components to this. So there's a good infographic from the NCSC, which are the 10 steps to cybersecurity. To kind of break this down a bit, you could think about it as driving. There are kind of two aspects to that. The first one is you have to pass your driving test, and the other part of that is that you have to have an MOT for a car to be safe on the roads. You can think of the bit in the middle as the driving test, and the theoretical part of the driving test is really the policy. So the starting point is to set up your what they call a risk management regime, which is really just setting out a cybersecurity policy for your organization, which is a statement intent of what sort of cybersecurity compliance you expect. Then the other 9 points around that are the controls that you put within your organization, and then that will be backed up by accreditation, which is effectively the MOT. So kind of stretching the analogy a wee bit, but if you think about brakes are part of the control in the system, and then the MOT will test the effectiveness of the brakes, but you have to understand what the brake's there for, to stop the car. Cybersecurity is very simple, very similar actually. So again, think of the driving test aspect and the MOT aspect. There's two parts to it. So within cybersecurity, there are these 10 steps, the policies at the start of it, in the core of it, and then there are the controls that go around it. And you can drill down within the NCSC to see what those steps are. What's also available, which is rather good, is for a small organization, they will put the absolute minimum that you need to do. So even if you're going for the use case A, you're still going to need some degree of cybersecurity. But what the NCSC have done, they've got a small business guide, and it's like, these are the things that you need to do. And actually, if you implement all of these, you're probably good to go in terms of compliance. But you need to have a cybersecurity policy that writes that down so that you say, we're going to do these things, and we've implemented these policies and procedures, so that you can specify, when it comes to procurement time, that you've done all these sort of things. So these are good guidelines, but it's not actually turning it into an actionable policy within your organization. And it's not evidential when it comes to, if you're going for, a public sector contract and you're responding to the tender, how you actually show the evidence for it. And that kind of comes down to your policy. So we talked about the controls around it, and we said that monitoring was part of the 10 steps to cybersecurity. And I want to show how simple a policy can be. This is actually an excerpt from one of our policies, and this was derived when we were, a huge organization. So these policies don't have to be war and peace. So the 10 steps to cybersecurity said you must monitor. So the policy for a 10,000 person organization was one sentence, okay? Which is the bit in orange, which says activity in the information systems must be monitored, recorded, and periodically reviewed to support investigation. So that just sets out your policy. That sets out the intent. And that's all it needs to be. Then there's the obligations to your employees. So it says management must ensure that, it says that auditable events and access to systems are logged, reviewed, and retained and protected. And that forms the policy. Then there's, what you're going to do about it, which is the procedures. And again, I stress that this is from, really big organization. The monitoring procedure, you must monitor the firewalls and scanning logs, store those logs, and then protect that information and restrict access to it. And then, literally that is, if it's one, piece of A4 that sets out the policy. And you can see that you can cross-reference with, guidance like this to put in specifics as well. So I want to reassure you that it's not too onerous to kind of get these policies started, and with very few exceptions, organizations are doing these things already. It's just not written down as a policy, so it's kind of difficult to audit in there. Okay, so that's an example of a policy. Now, the next step on the journey is that you might need accreditation, and that depends on the contract and depends on the tender, but they may require accreditation, and there are various levels of accreditation. So there are two ways to go about this. The first way is just to wing it. So you could say, okay, we'll wait and see what requirements are there. We'll kind of do the audit, and then we'll do it on a line-by-line basis based on what comes in on the. So it might, the tender might say you must monitor your networks, you must have password protection, and you can do it line by line. And if you fail on any of this, something is imposed which is called a cyber implementation plan, and you have to track that. That's quite bureaucratic, but it gets to the same point that you've got a degree of cybersecurity compliance. The other route to do it is actually to accredit. And there's a spectrum of things that you can do here. The first one is assessing yourself. And these are available for nothing on the web. And that will take you on a journey to get accredited. So really just have an honest appraisal of where you are and use the existing questionnaires. Again, they're not too onerous. And then also decide where you want to be. So if you're a small organization that has a unique service or a unique product, and you want to sell those products, just look at the minimum it's going to take to meet compliance on that. Don't look and say, okay, we're going to need ISO 27001 compliance, which is a long a organizations are happy to sell you that sort of compliance, but it's not necessarily appropriate for a small good of service. So assess yourself using IASME. So that's basically, it's a consortium that set up some really great resources to kind of understand where you are in terms of compliance, where your gaps are, and what sort of things you need to do. So go through in that link, you'll find a number of spreadsheets, and you can download those spreadsheets and have a look at those. What it also has is a decoder ring between all the different standards. So there's, the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So you can actually, it has a cross-reference to all the different standards, and then you can kind of self-assess yourself, define what kind of level you're at, and then look at what sort of contracts you would go after in the future. If your self-assessment goes well, then you can think about going for Cyber Essentials, and that's relatively cheap, and there's support available for that. And obviously, I'm not in a position to, give you advice on, what sort of stuff's available from the public sector, but there is help available for Cyber Essentials and voucher schemes, etc. And there's an overview of that scheme in the link. Then you can go to something else, which is Cyber Essentials Plus. So I'll explain the differences between that. And then you can go for the full accreditation, which is ISO 27001. So if you're providing a very large service or a very large critical service, then you have to provide evidence that you're going to be compliant and your processes are managed, etc. And that's a much bigger audit that's involved. So you can pick your battles, but I would advise you kind of grow into it. So start from self-assessment and then look to get accredited. So IASME, we've got the link to it there. You can see that it's actually, you can tick the boxes and do self-assessment. So you can see that it's kind of broken down into things like access control, which leads back into the 10 steps of cybersecurity. And then you can ask those questions, yes and no. And you can see that it links into things like Cyber Essentials. So basically, if you can tick all those boxes, you're in a pretty good position to meet Cyber Essentials, for the accreditation. Again, I stress this is all for nothing, and you can kind of just self-assess yourself by downloading the spreadsheet and going for it. What Cyber Essentials entails is basically it looks at your organization, and you do self-assessment, actually using a spreadsheet that's remarkably similar to the one you just saw. So you go through that, and you provide evidence within your security policies that you do all these things. And you can effectively self-assess, and you provide evidence in the shape of, well, look, my policy says that we retain all firewall logs for 30 days, for example. So once you have a cybersecurity policy in place, you can then start ticking the boxes for the self-assessment. The other thing that happens is there's an external scan. So basically, they kind of look at anything that, any web servers, for example, or email services, and they just check there's, no vulnerabilities on that, and just check there's no weird ways into that. And that's done remotely. So your connectivity to the internet is pinged. And that actually shows that everything within that little purple box is nice, safe, and secure. There's also something called Cyber Essentials Plus, which we got accredited to, which means that you supply a sample laptop, for example, and then they run a whole load of tests on that to make sure it's there. So it's a kind of like a bit of an advanced driving test, rather than kind of, some self-assessment stuff. They really put you on the spot to do that. And then the external scan that's done is, a bit more like a penetration test than opposed to a scan. But again, choose what level of maturity you're in. ISO 27001, we haven't went for, but as I say, if you're a big organization, or you're going to be supplying a critical service, or it's an ongoing part of a critical service, then you might have to go for that. In some respects, this is why the whole compliance industry gets a bad rap, because you can see it's actually 100 quid just to get the standard, and the standard's 23 pages. It doesn't seem good value for money. So it's better to use open source information. ISO 27001 is a very deep dive in your organization, and it's more to do with your business processes. So if you are going for ISO 9001, ISO 20000, then that's kind of part of the jigsaw. That will show that you've got kind of world-leading processes that can scale, very large, and that's entirely appropriate. It's not necessarily appropriate for an SME. Self-assessment's a much better route to think about, with a view towards Cyber Essentials. So we've got some example tenders. This is actually ones that Michael provided. Now, they're not 5G ones, but it kind of just shows you some examples here. This one's live. It's a baby tagging system for NHS Grampian. You can see that in the future, that may be a 5G type application. It's not, you wouldn't think of, it's not a 5G service, but there might be an RFID tag that you're supplying for that goes on the baby's leg or arm. There might be, links back to systems. So if, I don't know, if it was a birth in a remote area, then they might need to, when the baby's tagged, because it's a home birth, they might just put that information in a central system. Now, clearly you can see that there's, there's cyber security implications, but there's not national security implications. But there's a lot of personal data involved there, and there's some, it's connected to a government system. So in that case, that probably puts us at use case C, I would say, based on the criteria before, because we're linking into that. So you would expect a reasonably high degree of cybersecurity there. And I think the other question you would ask is, if you were a parent, what sort of level of security would you expect? What level of resilience would you expect? And then that should tell you what sort of expectations there will be on the procurement body about security and resilience on that as well. So that's a on there, you can see that maintenance support is required for 10 years. So your organization would have to be resilient. You know, any updates that you do would have to be resilient. Anything that apps that you're developing would have to be supported, and your developers' infrastructure would have to be there as well. So you can kind of say, well, that's, there's probably going to have to be good security policies in place to do that, and that expectation is, very reasonable. Here's another example tender, which is supply and installation of a local area network. This one could be two things. I've not shown the requirements, but what level of use case in that. If the tender was purely for running cables, installing equipment, testing that the equipment worked, and just making it happen, then that would probably be quite a low level of use case A. You'd be dealing with information that was, coming from the public sector, relating to personal information, possibly some IP addresses, the local area network that's providing those services. However, if you were supplying equipment and managing that equipment, then we start going up the stack a little bit. So if the system was air-gapped, let's say it was for libraries, for example, you're providing public internet access for a library, but it's not connected to government systems, you're just providing internet access, then that's probably use case B. And you need to think a bit more about that, because what are the implications of that infrastructure not being available in terms of a public service? What if it was used to, what's the reputational damage to the public sector if it was used to distribute malware, something like that? If it was connected, if it was going to provide interconnectivity between branch offices, for example, then that might be fixed wireless access. It might be running over 5G, but it might be interconnected to government systems. And that kind of puts you into use case C, because you've got that interconnectivity. You would expect a higher degree of compliance within your organization to make sure that the routers and the printers or whatever you supplied as part of that tender were maintained, you configured them correctly, all those sort of good implementations. You would have to provide evidence for that. And here's another tender for Renfrewshire. This is for a wide area network. And if you imagine that there was a reservoir and valves attached to this, and very likely actually if it's a wide area network, it could just be sensors for bins, or if it's controlling things like if it's providing connectivity to waterworks, water treatment plants, sewage plants, then that falls under critical infrastructure. There's an NIS directive, and you would fully expect that to be a deep dive within that. So there's 3 tenders there, and you can see that you can kind of decide, there may be varying levels of compliance required according to how they're in there. So really, what you need to do is kind of look at the tender. There will be, look at that, and then just understand that the compliance obligations that are expected of those tenders will be in line with how critical those use cases are. And then your response as a supplier is really just to pick your battles. You just look at a sober assessment of what the maturity is of your organization, and then choose the right ones. Because there's we used to work for Hewlett Packard, and one of the founders said that you never take a fortified hill, especially if their army is bigger than yours. So as I say, start small, grow in the maturity. This will enable more sales globally as well, because it shows your maturity as a supplier and the compliance, and then you can sort of start moving up the stack as well. And also you can start partnering with other prime contractors because you have that level of compliance, because the compliance that they're under will cascade down into you as well. So it actually opens up more stuff, and that was our experience as well. Okay, in summary, public sector contracts will increasingly need cybersecurity compliance. There's no getting away with it. We've seen more change in the last 11 months than we would expect in 10 years. It's been staggering. We made a lot of predictions about how things would be connected. It's just went on. So, I mean, it's just part and parcel of modern business, I'm afraid. There is more connectivity, and what goes with that is that there is, more cybersecurity compliance. To reassure you, there is transparency in the process. You can follow those links. You can download what the expectations are of government. You can look at how they define the use cases, and then you can just define how your goods and services fit into that. Another thing is that there's help available. The NCSC has some very good resources. Things like IASME are, really good free resources that help you guide through that. And then there's also help in, starting to set your policies. You can do this reactively. You can just say, we're going to go for this tender no matter what, and then there will be a long form, if you like. If you don't have accreditation, then you go to a different part of the tender that asks you lots and lots of questions. And if you don't meet those, you can still go ahead with an implementation plan. I recommend you don't do that, because it just becomes a lot of work tender after tender. It's better just to have your policies and procedures written down, understood, and then if it's going to repeat itself, then just go for accreditation to take that. So the more proactive approach is to self-assess yourself, document your policies and outcomes in advance, so you've kind of got those boxes ticked. And that's true of any sort of public sector contract, because there might be things about sustainability, your fitness as a supplier, and it almost becomes like a pro forma thing. If your self-assessment goes well, then you can start building a business case for accreditation. So that's the overall summary of it. Thank you for your time there. So part of that's been our journey. Hopefully there's some practical advice there, and pointed you some resources as well. Really the top takeaway is there's a huge opportunity with 5G, and it all relates to the public sector. There's lots of capability within Scotland, and it shouldn't be an inhibitor that there's a degree of compliance required. It's something that is achievable, and it's achievable, on a journey, step by step.
Thanks, Doug. Excellent. That was thoroughly comprehensive, insightful, and I found reassuring as well. So thank you so much for that. We don't have a lot of time left, because I've said we'll finish at 11 sharp. There are a few questions in, so if I could just do a quick rapid fire questions to you, that would be great. The first question came in, which is a sort of, will 5G Centre also include low bandwidth applications, i.e. LPWAN technologies?
Well, yeah, I think that one is for me. We've already discovered that the 5G type is getting a wee bit to training. So the centre will address all forms of advanced communications, and that's something that we will address in our messaging over the coming months. So the short answer to that is yes. Okay.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah. That's great. And I've had a question from Shan. Do you require to be compliant prior to bidding for tender? And does it apply to R&D projects such as can-do challenges that are tendered through the Public Contracts Scotland platform?
Yeah, so I can't speak to the sort of can-do thing, but certainly you don't need to be compliant prior to bidding for tender. What you do need to do is probably self-assess yourself. And the tender itself might have questions that you need to respond to. So you don't need to have accreditation per se. There's actually two different routes to go through. So our experience on some very big contracts are, it's kind of like, do you tick the ISO 27001 box? No, and then you go into a different set of questions. And it's just, really kind of question by question on incident response and monitoring, etc. So no, you don't have to, you know, I used a driving test analogy, but you can go on the road. You've basically got a provisional license if you've, you know, done some self-assessment. But you know, it's good to take the help that's available to actually just get the cyber essentials, because it's, as I say, it's a lot less work in the future.
Okay, thanks, Doug. And actually, Shan also said, excellent presentation, Doug, very informative. Thank you. And also, we got the similar message from Ricky Nicol at Comsworld, one of our silver partners. So thanks, Ricky. He's saying thank you for the presentation as well, and he's left a little message there to the panelists, which is great. I've got another question from one of the attendees. Is there a national accredited cyber compliance standard you can work to, similar to Investors and People, which can let public sector know of compliance?
I think Cyber Essentials is the main one in that. I think that's, you know, that was generated by the National Cybersecurity Centre. You can see that, you know, the Scottish Public Security Centre go on that to, you know, reach back into. So Cyber Essentials has kind of become the de facto one in the UK, and it's, you know, recognised worldwide that it leads into that. So we've been able to, you know, once we've had that accreditation, we've been able to use that work when we've went for contracts, you know, for example, in the Far East, for example, you know, to show that we've ticked those sort of things.
Okay, thanks, Doug. And there's a kind of double-headed question here in terms of how much of a cost distraction is it for SMEs to comply with these requirements? How much of a disincentive to tender do you think this is?
It can be, I think, if you overreach it and you know, try to go for, you know, full level of compliance and on that, it sometimes seems like hard work, you know, and you know, clearly everybody's running a business, you know, they don't want to be doing paperwork. They want to be, you know, delivering value to the customers. We kind of looked at, you can kind of look at it in the round. If you get a good cybersecurity posture and have that documented or accredited, it's actually kind of reduces your insurance, it reduces your risk in the organization, and it can kind of reduce your insurance premiums as well. So, you know, cybersecurity insurance is becoming more important, but with the impact of GDPR, your liability is limited. So you kind of have to look at that from a sort of risk management thing. So sometimes it's kind of, you know, just spending the money, some money up front and taking some time out will save you, you know, longer term, because the later you leave it, if it comes to a big incident, has GDPR implementations, then that's a risk on the organization and it's a liability. So, and you know, the reputational damage on that's huge. So sometimes it's difficult to quantify, but you kind of have to look at it in the round as well.
And just to be clear, Doug, and part of the question is there any way around this?
I think being pragmatic and you know, as I say, probably not is the short answer. But again, just do the minimum. You know, do the minimum that you have, and that means just being pragmatic. Do the self-assessment. Look at the small business guide, and these are just basic tips. But you know, the fact you've followed them limits liability down the line. So, and it also just makes your business more efficient and probably at less risk of, you know, various problems, because when things do go wrong and it's an IT problem, then it's just a drain on the organization in general. So I kind of think of that as not just as a kind of cybersecurity cost thing, but just like efficiencies in the organization themselves, and try and build that into the business case, which is what we tried to do when we done it.
Great. Oh no, listen, thank you for that, Doug. And I'm afraid we're going to have to draw things to a conclusion there. We've kind of run out of time. So if we haven't managed to get to your questions or your points, we can certainly put those to the panelists and come back to you separately. And let's keep the conversation going. I want to say a big thank you to Doug for sharing the journey and being so honest with us. And as you said before, you've been in our shoes. You know, some of the key takeaways there for me were 5G brings big public service opportunities, and it's not just about connectivity. opportunities to grow your customer base and to join the supply chain. Please think carefully about the supply chain, be clear and transparent in your objectives and your communication, and pick your battles and assess where you are and where you want to be going and heading. And there is support available for Cyber Essentials, as Doug explained. So thank you a huge amount to you both this morning, to Doug and to Michael. And thanks to your businesses, to Illuminate Technologies and to the Scotland 5G Centre. As I said, we'll keep these conversations going, and please keep in touch if you've any other questions, and we'll certainly make the slides available to all attendees today as well. Please also just keep an eye out on the Chamber website for forthcoming events. Alan and the team have put together a massive amount of events over the last 7 or 8 months, and that will continue into the new year with big events like COP26 coming to Glasgow. And I know that we have an event penciled in the diary for Friday, the 5th of February, which is very much looking at how smart cities around the world have dealt with COVID. And we've got panelists from the British Chamber of Commerce Shanghai and the British Chamber of Commerce Australia, based in Sydney, taking part in that conversation on the 5th of February. So check out the website for details. But thanks again to Doug and to Michael for their contributions this morning. And thank you for you two attending. Please keep in touch and have a Merry Christmas and holiday season when it comes. Keep in touch and bye for now. Thank you.